In our headlines on this Thursday afternoon, March 21st, here in South Korea. Junior doctors who continue to defy the government's return to work order will face official license suspension starting next week as their walkout over plans to expand medical school admissions quota persists over a month. Meanwhile, policymakers at the US Federal Reserve are keeping their interest rate between 5.25% and 5.5% for the fifth session in a row, but are also maintaining their projections of 3 rate cuts within the year. And a panel of pundits at the United Nations sound the alarm again over North Korea's illicit access to essential funds for its hostile weapons ambitions through cyber crime, which reportedly amounted to some $3 billion between 2017 and 2023. Junior doctors here engaged in collective action against government plans to expand medical school admissions quota are poised to face tangible repercussions come next week. Our Shin Se-byuk has the latest.
Starting next week, the government will begin suspending the licenses of trainee doctors who have not returned to hospitals. Urging defiant doctors to return to their patients' sites, Second Vice Health Minister Park Min-soo issued stern warnings on Thursday, stating they would face consequences otherwise.
Starting next week, the government will enforce license suspensions for doctors who have defied the return-to-work order.
Park also called on new interns who have so far failed to register at hospitals to do so by the end of this month, highlighting that this is necessary for them to advance to becoming residents next year. If the government proceeds with the suspensions, they will take place some 5 weeks after trainee doctors walked out of hospitals en masse, protesting the government's decision to increase medical school admission seats by 2,000 starting next year. The health ministry has issued prior suspension notices to about 5,000 trainee doctors who must submit their responses by next Monday. Following this, the ministry will proceed with issuing formal suspension notices. Thursday's announcement came a day after the Education Ministry announced details on how the additional 2,000 places at medical schools will be allocated. According to the current plan, most seats will be distributed to medical schools outside the capital area to better address the shortage of medical services in rural areas. That figure is 1,639 seats, approximately 82% of the total. Based on the announcement, each university will have its new quotas reflected in its admission announcements for the 2025 academic year, which will be released to students around May. Following the government's announcement, medical school professors, trainee doctors, medical students, and medical associations convened on Wednesday night to strategize their response. The primary focus of the meeting was to discuss when professors from medical schools nationwide might submit their resignation letters. Professors from leading national universities have agreed to resign en masse. However, they have not yet settled on a specific date for taking that step. Professors from Seoul National University and Yonsei University have already marked March 25th as their resignation submission date, while professors at other universities including Ulsan National University and Seonggyun University are still fine-tuning their plans. In the meantime, the government plans to host an open discussion on Thursday afternoon aimed at addressing concerns and improving the conditions of medical residents. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
Right. Also on the issue of healthcare, President Yoon Suk-yeol has shared the government's commitment to caring for its senior citizens through public housing and medical support. In a policy briefing on this Thursday, this time in Wonju City in Gangwon-do Province, he pledged 3,000 public homes annually for the less fortunate elderly. Silver Stay, a senior living project that includes comprehensive services, was also announced. As for medical support, he vowed to expand at-home medical care, raising the number of long-term home visit centers to 250 nationwide. Curtains went down on the third Summit for Democracy Wednesday evening Korea time with a virtual plenary session of global leaders during which President Yoon Suk-yeol called for collaboration in defending democracy from disinformation amid a record number of elections this year worldwide. Our senior correspondent Oh Soo-young covers his remarks.
President Yoon has called on the free world to create joint high-tech countermeasures against fake news and the misuse of digital technology to prevent these from threatening democracy. During the third Summit for Democracy hosted by South Korea, Yoon opened a virtual plenary session of 36 world leaders on Wednesday local time, co-chairing the session with Denmark and Kenya. As more than 60 countries representing half of the world's 8 billion people hold elections this year, Yoon focused on artificial intelligence, elections and fake news, underscoring the need to protect electoral integrity as the foundation of democracy.
특정 세력들이 조직적으로 제작하고 배포하는 가짜 뉴스는 단순히 잘못된 정보를 전파하는 것을 넘어 사회적 갈등과 분열을 야기합니다. 또한 가짜 뉴스는 국민들이 사실과 다른 정보를 바탕으로 잘못된 판단을 내리도록 선동함으로써 민주주의 근간인 선거를 위협하고 있습니다. 이는 민주주의에 대한 분명한 도발입니다.
As societies become more and more exposed and susceptible to AI-generated content on online platforms, heavily curated with algorithms, the South Korean leader said democratic countries should jointly develop AI and digital systems to detect and eradicate forces that utilize the same technologies to generate fake news. This requires solidarity and the sharing of technology, he said, adding that the international community must also stand together to enforce measures against foreign intervention in elections. Joining the conversation, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said the use of deepfakes and audio created by AI undermines people's rights to make their own political choices, making society become unstable and divided. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres added the world must build guardrails for artificial intelligence and the digital world.
The summit's theme, Democracy for Future Generations, reminds us of an additional essential responsibility. We must strengthen democratic systems and institutions for and with the world's 1.8 billion young people and for the generations to follow.
Noting that democracy spurs creativity and innovation by empowering individuals, the leaders also emphasised the need to build inclusive practices and capacity for democratic governance, especially in the Global South. South Korea on Thursday released a summary of key opinions shared throughout the summit. These include the potential for using advanced technologies to enhance democracy, such as by widening channels for political participation, as well as the inclusion of young people, women and social minorities. They also agreed on the need to strengthen laws and measures to mitigate the risks that new technologies pose to privacy and electoral integrity, and agreed with Yoon's call to strengthen cooperation on technology to counter such threats. Emphasising that advancing democracy takes collective effort beyond those made by a single country, President Yoon said that Seoul will collaborate with other governments, international organisations and private actors as well to strengthen and expand democratic solidarity based on shared universal values. Seoul, Arirang News.
On the local political front, candidate registration for the April parliamentary election is underway, and political parties have shared their key commitments for the 22nd National Assembly. Our correspondent Shin Ha-young reports.
Candidate registration for South Korea's general election has begun. It will run for 2 days starting today from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Personal details including asset declarations, military service status, and criminal records of registered candidates will be publicly available through the National Election Commission's website. Both the ruling and main opposition parties last week each announced their 10 key pledges for the next 4 years with a shared emphasis on tackling the country's low birth rate. The People Power Party outlined its key pledges, focusing on 3 primary agendas: addressing the low birth rate, narrowing the widening wealth gap, and addressing climate change. The Democratic Party's commitments are centered around 4 major objectives: enhancing people's livelihoods, providing hope for the future, protecting democracy, and fostering peace. The party's focus lies in extending financial assistance to newlywed couples, such as providing public rental housing to couples with more than 1 child. Cities with major chipmakers plants including SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics in Gyeonggi-do Province, known as the Semiconductor Belt, are emerging as pivotal swing regions. Parties have been announcing chip-related pledges and nominating influential candidates in these areas. The ruling party pledged full support for the government's plan to create a mega chip cluster in Gyeonggi-do province by 2047 and simplify the process for chip development and investment permits.
The semiconductor belt is essentially a creation of the People Power Party. We are the ruling party, and President Yoon has made a lot of diplomatic efforts regarding semiconductor issues.
Meanwhile, the main opposition party has committed to creating an ecosystem for a semiconductor powerhouse through regulatory reforms and tax incentives. These include extending the tax deduction deadline for investments in national strategic technologies and establishing so-called semiconductor megacities in the southern and eastern regions of Gyeonggi-do province.
The semiconductor industry is the key engine for South Korea's economy. With the increasing significance of chips, competition is escalating, transforming into a national-level competition.
After the two-day registration period, candidates can run their official election campaign from next Thursday until April 9, the day before the general election. 신하영, Arirang News.
The head of U.S. Forces Korea, General Paul LaCamera, has highlighted the importance of maintaining U.S. troops here in South Korea. Remarks to the Senate were shared on Wednesday during a hearing at the House Armed Services Committee in Washington. They also follow concerns over the fate of the 28,500 American servicemen and women stationed here in the country in the event of a potential shift in U.S. leadership following November's presidential election. General LaCamera called for the need to continue competing, quote, in the gray zone with North Korea amid its weapons ambitions, and also made note of the fact that China and Russia were, quote, mindful of U.S. presence in the region. Meanwhile, a panel of pundits at the United Nations have sounded the alarm yet again over North Korea's rampant access to essential funds for its hostile weapons ambitions through cyber crime. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
The UN Security Council Sanctions Committee on North Korea on Wednesday released its biannual report, which included details of military and political tensions on the Korean Peninsula over the 6 months from July 2023 to January 2024. The report said that not only have tensions on the Korean Peninsula heightened, but that according to a panel of experts, North Korea obtained half of its total foreign currency income through financial theft via hacking and cyber attacks. They added that such funds were obtained to cover 40% of the resources needed for developing weapons of mass destruction. The report says while there hasn't been a 7th nuclear test, the regime has been developing additional nuclear weapons and producing fissile materials to avoid UNSC sanctions. The panel pointed out that the continuous cyber attacks targeting the virtual asset industry is also a means of generating revenue by avoiding UNSC sanctions. As the crippling sanctions made it nearly impossible to obtain foreign currency needed to develop nuclear weapons and other missile technologies, hacking is used as the main means of earning such income. The report stated that it's currently investigating 17 cases of virtual currency theft last year in which North Korea was suspected to have been involved. The total amount stolen through such means amounts to $750 million. When looking at the amount stolen by North Korean hacking organizations between 2017 and 2023, the figure is a staggering $3 billion. The report also said the possibility of a technology transfer between Pyongyang and Moscow, which further fuels the regime's continued nuclear weapons development, is currently being investigated. The Sanctions Committee inspects the implementation of the international community's UNSC sanction against North Korea and reports the results of its activities to the UN twice a year. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
U.S. monetary policymakers have decided to maintain their interest rates at current levels for the time being. Our economics correspondent Lee Soo-jin covers this decision and its broader implications for the Bank of Korea.
U.S. Federal Reserve officials kept rates unchanged for the 5th consecutive time on Wednesday, following the second two-day Federal Open Market Committee meeting this year. With this latest move, the benchmark interest rates in the U.S. continue to stand in the range of 5.25% to 5.5%. And the key interest rate gap between South Korea and the U.S. remains at 2 percentage points, as the Bank of Korea also froze its rates for the 9th consecutive meeting in February. The U.S. Fed's decision to once again freeze interest rates, along with South Korea's consumer prices once again entering 3% territory last month, is increasing the likelihood of the Bank of Korea also keeping rates steady at the current rate of 3.5% at next month's decision rate meeting. There has been much speculation about when the Fed will begin cutting interest rates, with observers forecasting that rate cuts will come in the second half of the year. Following this latest meeting, policymakers forecast that 3 rate cuts will come by the end of the year, consistent with earlier forecasts and supported by the Fed chairman's comments.
We believe that our policy rate is likely at its peak for this tightening cycle, and that, if the economy evolves broadly as expected, it will likely be appropriate to begin dialing back policy restraint at some point this year.
A fresh set of quarterly U.S. economic estimates has also been released, showing an elevated projection for inflation due to slower than expected progress towards the Fed's 2% target. The forecast says the personal consumption expenditures price index, excluding food and energy, will rise at a rate of 2.6% by the end of the year, compared to the 2.4% projection issued in December. And during Thursday's emergency macroeconomic meeting in South Korea, attended by the country's key economic leaders to discuss the potential impact of the U.S. Fed's rate freeze, Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok said that there is growing uncertainty about the timing of rate cuts in other countries, especially with the Bank of Japan's decision earlier this week to raise interest rates for the first time in 17 years. 이수진, Arirang News.
In other news, former crypto entrepreneur Kwon will be facing a South Korean court on charges of fraud for which he may spend decades behind bars, our Yoon reports.
The Montenegrin Court of Appeals finalized on Wednesday the extradition of Do Kwon to his home country, South Korea. In a statement on its website, the court said that it had rejected an appeal by Kwon's legal representatives and upheld a decision by the country's high court on March 6th to hand over Kwon to South Korea rather than to the United States. The Court of Appeals assessed that the first instance court correctly determined that the request for Kwon to be extradited to South Korea arrived before the U.S. one. This verdict means the case is now closed regarding the country that Kwon will be extradited to. The Montenegrin Ministry of Justice will now set the exact date for his extradition. According to Bloomberg, that could take place as early as this weekend, when his prison sentence in Montenegro for using forged documents comes to an end. Quan was captured at an airport in Montenegro in March of 2023 as he attempted to board a private flight to the United Arab Emirates on a forged passport. After remaining in custody from the time of his arrest, he was sentenced to 4 months in prison in June of last year. An appeal against that ruling was rejected by a higher court, and the sentence began in November. Quan faces prosecution for several criminal charges in South Korea and the U.S. South Korean prosecutors issued an arrest warrant for Quan over allegations related to the crash of Terra USD and Luna coins in May 2022, which it's estimated wiped out nearly $37 billion in market value. Quan is also wanted in the U.S., where he was charged with fraud by federal prosecutors in New York. Interpol also issued a red notice for Quan, which is used for the highest level of wanted suspects and criminals. 이은진, Arirang News.
On the trade front, Korea's Ramyeon exports hit a fresh high last month. According to the Korea Customs Service on Thursday, the total value of Ramyeon exports in February amounted to $93 million, up over 31% on year, breaking a previous record set in November last year. Given this latest finding, pundits believe ramen exports are on track to surpassing $1 billion for the first time by the year's end. In baseball news, these Los Angeles Dodgers beat the San Diego Padres by 5 runs to 2 here in Seoul Wednesday evening to kick off the opening match of this year's Major League Baseball. Japanese player Shohei Ohtani staged his much-anticipated debut with a comeback win for the Dodgers. Now, some 16,000 fans were on site at Kochok Skydome to watch Korea's first hosting of an MLB regular season game. A second face-off between the two teams is scheduled for this Thursday evening at the same stadium.
Let's take a look at the latest news in the world now. On Wednesday, Ireland's Taoiseach Leo Varadkar announced his resignation as Prime Minister and leader of the ruling Fine Gael party. He quoted personal and political reasons for his surprise move. Speaking at a press conference in Dublin, 45-year-old Varadkar said that he no longer feels fit for leadership and that the time is now to pass on the baton. He added that his time as the country's leader was the most fulfilling of his life. While Varadkar's resignation as head of the three-party coalition government does not trigger a general election, he said he asked for a successor to be elected before Fine Gael's annual conference on April 6th. The elected party leader will then be subject to a vote in Parliament before he or she is appointed as the Prime Minister. Leo Varadkar was Ireland's youngest Prime Minister when he became Fine Gael party leader at 38 in 2017. He is also the first openly gay Irish leader. The European Commission proposed on Wednesday a plan to transfer profits generated from frozen Russian assets in Europe to Ukraine. This would mean that most of some $3 billion of annual profit from the frozen Russian central bank assets would be spent on the Ukrainian military. Currently, there are about $230 billion of frozen Russian central bank assets held in various currencies across the European Union. The exact amount of profit each year depends on global interest rates. Under the EU plan, 90% of the funds taken from Russia would be used to buy weapons for Ukraine, while rest would be used for recovery and reconstruction. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell met with Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, after which he urged member states to approve the plan quickly. Shmyhal said that Ukraine expected the EU and G7 countries to confiscate the original Russian capital itself. Moscow said on the same day that the measure is banditry and theft that would destroy Europe's reliable reputation of safeguarding financial and property rights. According to the latest World Happiness Report released on Wednesday, Finland remains the happiest country in the world for the 7th year in a row. The World Happiness Report, produced as part of the United Nations Global Initiative, measures the absence of corruption, freedom, generosity, health, income and social support to determine a country's national happiness. Nordic nations Denmark, Iceland and Sweden were just below the top spot. Afghanistan and Lebanon were at the bottom of the list. Kim Seong, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. We had a colder start than Wednesday, but with less wind, it made it more bearable. Afternoon highs should go up higher than Wednesday, but still hovering below the seasonal norms. It was a colder morning for mountainous regions, so there is a big gap in ratings in most places. Do dress accordingly. It's always better to feel a little warmer. Meanwhile, nearly 25 centimeters of snow fell in mountainous regions in Gangwon-do yesterday, which helped to ease the dryness in the air. But the rest of the east is still under a dry weather advisory, while the east of Seoul is under a dry advisory for the first time this season. Then highs in Seoul will be topping out at 11 degrees. Daejeon, Jeju make it to 12 degrees Celsius this afternoon. It should not be as windy as yesterday under sunny skies nationwide throughout the day today. Then more rain is in the forecast across Korea for the next 5 days, but it will get much warmer towards Sunday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And that wraps up our Thursday afternoon newscast. We have our daily panel session coming up right after this break, so do stay with us. Thank you for now.